Good afternoon, class. So, on we go with our financing segment of the course. We're going to go on to chapter 9 for those who have the book. We're going to talk about the appraisal process. And in your book, if you have the book, we're going to start off on chapter 9-8 and the section on the appraisal process, actually 9-9. So that's where we're going to start off today's section, and we're going to learn about what an appraiser does. And there's three major approaches that an appraiser will take toward a project when they've been hired. And so what happens with the appraisal process? So when the appraiser is engaged by, let's say, the closing, the loan officer, okay, at the bank, because the bank is the entity that's going to be hiring the appraiser. Nobody else really does. There's other reasons that we'll talk about in class why someone would want an appraisal for a piece of property or to appraise something. But in this particular section, we're going to talk about real estate because that's what we're learning, right? So an appraiser is engaged by the bank because the bank wants to make sure that the collateral, the real estate that is being posted into the deal has enough value to support the loan. So that's what this is all about. It's the bank making sure that its interest is secured. That's it in a nutshell. So now the appraiser is engaged by the loan officer or by the bank, by the underwriting department, whatever it is in the bank. And so the appraiser is going to go into a process, and that process is here on the outline. So the first step in the process that an appraiser is going to take is defining the problem, and they're going to identify or the identification of the property by legal description. Okay. And then they're going to do a preliminary analysis and plan what they're going to need to do, right? Like any other plan, they're going to do an analysis, right? Cost benefit type of a thing. And they're going to see what type of approach they're going to take. Now, there are three basic approaches that they can take. There's the comparison approach, which for those that are going into the residential area of real estate, that's most likely the approach that's going to be taken by the appraiser. They're going to compare properties, okay? And there's going to be elements or there's going to be factors that they're going to look at with each appraiser, each appraisal report that they need to do. There's the income approach, and then there's the cost approach. These two approaches are used primarily in commercial settings when an appraiser is trying to place a value on a big commercial property. The properties that are commercial in nature, those properties are a little bit more difficult to do the comparison approach on, okay? But as we're going to talk about in class, an appraiser is going to take as many approaches as he or she can, to support their valuation at the end in their report. All right, so what else? Well, the appraiser then goes on to data selection and collection and analysis, all right? And that's really the next step. This outline, actually, this should be falling into place with 1, 2. This should be number 3. And so with data selection, collection, and analysis, all the necessary data is collected from different sources identified. I'm reading right out of the book. Care should be taken to compile only the information that relates to the problem to avoid confusion, okay? Any full legal description, compliance with zoning, building codes, permits for any specialized usage, as in business economic conditions in the community relative to uses of the subject property, okay? So that's data selection. All the next necessary data is collected. Then we move on to the next one, which is land value estimate. And that's the highest and best use analysis, okay? Zoning laws and values of similar parcels sold. So they're going to look at the land itself and place a value on the parcel of land where the building sits. Then they're going to try to apply all three approaches. Okay, and I'm flipping the page in the book. They're going to try to apply all three of the approaches because it's like a checks and balances, right? So the appraiser should use any or as many of the three approaches as possible in estimating the value. It's like a series of checks and balances to see if he's in the right ballpark, right? Reconciliation of values and estimates. If the estimate included in all three approaches that varied significantly, must choose the appropriate one. So if the values are kind of all over the place, they're kind of skewed, then he's got to fall into place, he or she's, the appraiser that is, has got to fall into place with the most or the commonly used approach, okay? As I mentioned in the beginning, in the residential setting, the most commonly used approach is the comparison approach. So if the other two approaches don't jive, they don't match, or they don't come into the same ballpark, he or she's most likely going to fall upon the custom in this type of a scenario, and that's the approach that they're going to use. And then a final report. Okay, a final report is produced by the appraiser, and at the end they're going to show all three approaches, and then they're going to render an opinion as to value. So some of it's subjective, right? Some of it's on their own experience and belief and research, and then there's the actual approaches. Some of it is objective, right? So the first of the approaches that we're going to talk about now, that we talked about what an appraiser does, okay, the process. That's how they try to get to where they need to be, right? So let's talk about the three approaches that an appraiser will take. First one is the market approach, and this is the most common one in a residential setting, as I mentioned, okay? It involves comparing the property to be appraised with other properties that have sold in the same or similar areas. Okay, like types of properties or neighborhoods are looked at. The appraiser's job is to make the adjustments up or down in the comparable values. Okay, and in the book it gives you an example. In my book it's a 9-11, but you can see the example. It almost looks like a table, and the types of factors that an appraiser will look at when they're doing the comparison approach is they will look at the dates. Basically, in this example, there are three comparisons that the appraiser takes. There may be more depending on the area. Like if the appraiser's in a place like Somerville, they might look at a few different comparisons. They might go 4 or 5 comparisons, right? Just to see in that area, because Somerville kind of jumps all over the place. It's skewed depending on what area you're in. They can go for millions of dollars. They can go for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the appraiser might take a few extra comparisons in the area to try and get accurate value. Factors that an appraiser will look at in their whole process, I guess we can say. They can look at the dates, right? They're going to try to take the sales in a time frame. It could be 6 months, could be within the last year, to try and gauge the market, right? Because as we know, the real estate market will climb and it will decline through time. It's a cycle. It does this, right? And so depending on what area of the circle we are in with the cycle, the appraiser will look at the dates, right, in a different fashion. But they will look at dates. They will look at the sales that have happened in a time frame. Total number of rooms in the house, right? Just the physical layout, bathrooms, baths, lot size, right? Because a house sitting on a smaller lot might go for a lesser value depending on the area it's in, right? Garage, if it has a garage, the age of the structure, the proximity to the subject, what it's near, and the condition. Okay, the condition of the property also goes into the comparison approach. Now, oftentimes you, as a real estate agent, will be asked to provide an opinion of value, okay, or a comparative market analysis. I call it a CMA. And so you, as a real estate agent out on the market, will need to do this process. And most likely, if you're dealing with residential setting and you have a seller that comes in the door, you know, people have delusions of grandeur at times, right? They think that their house is worth $1 million, and you actually do a market analysis to try and set that house at the proper price. Because the question is, what do we set it at, right? And a lot of times you could set it at a price, and in this market that we're in right now, it is a seller's market. There will be bidding wars with the buyers, so let there be a bidding war, but you have to set the price right. And oftentimes that's a subject of conflict between you and your seller, because the seller might have a delusion that their house is worth a lot more, and you see the market analysis is as it's not where the seller thinks it should be. And so there might be a little bit of a disagreement between you and your seller, but eventually I would hope that you would come to a price that you both can decide on, someplace in the middle, and try to set the price with the understanding that the price will drop, right? You will drop the price if you don't get an offer. So in any event, that is the comparative approach. Next, we go on to the commercial setting, and we got the income approach that the appraiser will use in trying to set a value on a commercial piece of property, used for investment or income properties. And one of the things that we look at when we're trying to set that is the capitalization rate. And we capitalize on our opportunities, return the one desires on invested funds, okay? It's the what return a person wants on their investments, okay? And so with the income approach, there are some factors that we look at. There is the market value. There's three factors, right? The worth of the property. The net income is very important, okay? And it's the gross income or the total income that a property takes in minus the expenses of that property. And you get the net, right? You subtract the net from the gross. And then there's the capitalization rate, okay? And so to come to value in the income approach, the appraiser is going to use an equation, well, a few equations, but this is one of the equations that the appraiser will use. And in the income approach, they will look at the net income. Just change that back. They'll look at the net income and they'll place it over what they determine to be the capitalization rate. Okay, and that is the equation for value. Now, how does one come to the capitalization rate? Well, there's a couple different ways that an appraiser can come to the capitalization rate. This isn't in your book, by the way. This is just from experience. So the capitalization rate can come from research. Okay, the appraiser can look at some nationally published magazines and periodicals to determine a capitalization rate for a particular area. The other way it's done is there's an equation, like everything else. It's net income over value. Net income over value is the equation for the capitalization rate. So on the test, if the testers are asking you to come to a capitalization rate and they give you the net income, they're going to have to give you some elements, right? They're not going to make it that nasty. They have to give you the net income of a property, or the components of net income to the property, and then they're going to have to give you a value. And so you'll take your net income, you'll place it over your value, and that will give you a capitalization rate. We'll talk more about that in class. Okay. And then there's the gross rent multiplier. Okay. And with the gross rent multiplier, or the GRM, appraisers will also, it says right in the book here on 913, appraisers also use what is called the gross rent multiplier to come up with a quick estimate or ballpark figure. To use this method, the appraiser will have to know the average relationship that gross incomes on properties have to past selling prices. Okay, and then they give you an example. So that's in the book. Gross rent multiplier. Know what that is? And they give you an example in the book to go through. the last of the approaches that an appraiser will take, usually on commercial properties. But they'll try with residential properties as well, as I mentioned. They'll try to do as many of the 3 approaches as they can. This method best used in properties that can't be evaluated by the other 2 approaches, okay? Or as a check, right? Checks and balances, as I mentioned in the beginning to you. The appraiser starts with the reproduction cost, the cost of of an exact duplicate of the building, or the replacement cost, the cost of a similar but not the exact duplicate, right? Then subtract out depreciation of the building for the value. This would be an estimate of the market value, okay? To estimate the replacement cost, the unit in place method is used, which sums the cost of each component of the unit, of the structure. So it takes all of the different components, values for each of the components of the structure, tallies them together. That's all. Another approach is the square foot approach. My phone. Another approach is the square foot approach. The cost of replacing a structure with certain dimensions, okay? And with the square foot approach, a good appraiser will know the approximate value of a square foot of a particular structure. Other methods in determining replacement, physical deterioration. Okay, so there's other methods of determining replacement cost. And then we go into depreciation. What types of depreciation are out there? There is the physical deterioration of a building, the wearing out of a building. There is the functional obsolescence of a building. Okay, the property's out of date. There is the economic obsolescence, the deterioration of an deteriorating neighborhood, or as a result of toxic waste. Okay, and as it says here, not all decreases in value are incurable. So that is depreciation. We will talk about that in class. So this, folks, is a segment of the appraisal process, or the appraisal chapter, chapter 9. We will go over the rest of the chapter live and field your questions as we go. So that is the segment that I wanted to cover today, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time around.